Welcome, everybody, to the Journal of Health Promotion Practices special series of podcasts on people, power, and photo voice, the little method that could change the world. My name's Robin Evans-Agnew, and I'm a co-editor of the special issue coming up. We're totally focused on photo voice in January 2022. And for those of you new to Photo Voice, it's a participatory visual method where participants take and discuss photos on health promotion issues relevant to their lives and then act to change them through raising awareness, mitigation of the problems, or transformation of the policies that oppress. In advance of the publication, we wanted you to meet some of the folks behind the special issue with a brief opportunity to chat about their experiences with the method, the people they work with, and their thoughts about the roots and the frontiers of application for this method in the world of health promotion. So take it away, Bob. You're going to introduce our guests for us?
That's great. I can tell it's another day, another podcast, but you are still on it, Robin, and I love to do this stuff, work with you, and I love the fact we've got two great authors, thinkers, scholars of photo voice joining us today. We've got Ed Mamary joining us from California. He's going to talk about some of his work he's doing, and we're very excited to have Michelle Teddy in the house, who's going to springboard on her work and also reflect on some of the things that overlap with Ed. I know there's a lot that we want to talk about, and Rob, we've got a couple questions that we're really curious about digging in with these two, don't we?
Right. Because I love photo voice, because when I was starting to do photo voice, people were like, how can you take photographs of something that you can't see, like asthma, right? Well, we have something that you are both have in common. This is working with participants with HIV. And the title of this overall show is, I've called it, at least the working title is Getting to the Show and Tell and Activism of Photo Voice, Participatory Curation and of the Photo Voice Exhibit, right? So that's really a large part of our conversation today. Ed kind of suggested that idea, but really sort of how do you broach the topic? And we'll probably start with Ed because, you know, he had the topic. How do you broach the topic of displaying participant work relating to a sensitive issue like HIV and sexuality? How does that work? How do we get to that particular moment?
Okay, Ed. Well, so I gave a lot of thought, and when I think about the scope of work within this individual project, the particular project that I think Michelle and I, the topic of HIV, our particular project was with African-American men who did not identify as being gay and who had sex with men, and it was around their HIV prevention and sexual health. When I think about their scope of work, I think that we actually had no issues around photos and their stories that were being told. And I think a lot had to do with the way that we framed the project. And one of the things is that they had a story to tell. So here were African-American men who were never really asked about their experiences. And this was their opportunity through Photo Voice to do just that, to talk about their sexual health, to talk about what was their experience as being African-American men who had sex with men. And that was a pretty empowering process for them. That's the first thing. The second thing was, I think that we kept the Photo Voice questions and the assignment broad enough to really relate to their life experience. So it was broad enough, and they were able to bring in their issues around sexuality, but they were really linked to societal kinds of issues.
So it's sort of like the process itself lends itself towards that moment where you're going to show a part of your life, because I think it was you had a website with I think it was Our Lives or something else like that.
That was the Photo Voice project that they named Our Lives.
Right, Our Lives. Yeah. So that's lovely. So Michelle, how does that work for you and your population with reflection?
Yeah.
Okay, great, and then display.
Yeah. So I mean, to just back up for 1 second, I mean, I've been doing Photo Voice for a little over 10 years, and it's been mostly with people living with HIV and a bit with folks at risk for HIV. And then I've worked with some other groups with sort of stigmatized illnesses. So I really relate to that point that Ed made about the lack of space for people to talk about their lives and how that kind of shapes the framing of the project and how people want to share. So I started out like way in a separate younger life where I was an interventionist. So I was working with people with HIV and trying to convince them to use condoms and like tell their partners they had HIV. And, you know, that was like kind of not relevant to their lives at all. And they really wanted to just tell their stories and tell them in creative ways. And that's what led me to Photo Voice. It's kind of exactly the point that Ed was making. So when I started doing photo voice projects, they were kind of grounded in what folks wanted that I could, that I was experiencing. And because of that, like all qualitative projects too, it was sort of like a very purposeful sampling, right? So people who would sign up for these projects were people who were interested in sharing their stories. So, we can talk about the limits of that, but I feel like that's a big strength of qualitative work too, and that you're very purposeful about who you're recruiting. And they came into it wanting to exhibit. So it wasn't like Ed saying, I haven't found it as challenging to exhibit around sensitive issues, but they are sensitive issues. So there are definitely
you got to have that
issues
conversation, right? I mean, you got to have that conversation at some point in time with an image or a group of images or selecting images. But what I'm hearing from both of you is that the conversation begins right at that entry point, right? The people
yes, it
have
does.
something to share.
Well, this constants of the conversation we had last time, Robin, where the centrality of the participants become like the experts in the room.
Right.
And the invitation that you give and the space that you give, it was easy for people to walk through that door and be a part of the collaborative effort to generate data, generate voice, generate ideas. It's a whole new way of interacting with the collection of data and the purposefulness of getting it displayed for other people to see. So
but they're not experts in display or exhibition, right?
No, right. So that's where you come in.
No, yeah, and I do think there are these limits, right, that you also need to talk about from the beginning. So the realities, right, and this is kind of what we all face with community-based participatory research. But the IRB, it's there to protect everybody, but there's also limits. In my case, my IRB is always making rules around, like, they don't want anything in exhibition from minors, so that's just something that I need to be upfront about right away. Right. When it comes to other people in photographs, we could go on about that, but there's all kinds of discussions you have with participants, and there can be limits on that. I set up additional limits with the group around things that are illegal, basically around safety. I don't want to be displaying pictures where you're shown doing illegal things. You're shown doing things like half off the Grand Canyon where you're going to fall and hurt yourself or something, right. So I set up initial limits around safety that kind of come from broader, the institutions, the IRB, and just the ideas of protecting people. So they do shape also what can or can't be in exhibit.
Have you found that to be a struggle? I mean, in your work, Ed, did you find that people wanted to show things that you felt like really shouldn't be shown, or was that sort of participant driven by them?
How do you make those decisions?
Yeah, so in the African American studies, so this one man, he wanted to talk about the joy of life and family, and how the joy of life and family is really protective of his health. And so he has a picture of his son, and it's like a really poignant, talk about his son and how wonderful his son is, and it's in the neighborhood. And so he actually showed the picture of his son. And so we actually talked about, so what do we do? So with the IRB that we have, they're anonymous. And so we decided that we would actually show the picture of his son, but the face was blurred. So to protect the anonymity of that picture. And he was happy to do that. So we wanted to be able to present that photo, because that's what was really important, not only to him, but to the whole group. So that was one situation that we had.
That's how you navigated that decision point.
That's how we navigated that decision point.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a great point around exhibitions. They are a sort of push and pull in discussion, because there is some navigation. And I have also found participants really open to that navigation. So, when I say, we're not going to be able to show you doing illegal activities because we need to protect you. We need to have some boundaries. And people say, well, illegal drug use was a totally important part of my HIV experience. Then how do I show it? And then we go back and forth and talk about it. And I've had people take pictures of a place where they overdosed, for example. And that was a way for them to talk about it that removed them from the picture.
This is what I love. This is why I'm so glad you're here, Michelle, because this is an easy line of photo voice, right? It's not, are you taking a picture of your lived reality, or are you taking a picture of a metaphor, right? Of your work, because of because of some of the strictures that IRB have put in, but also
Right.
because of the
protection.
respect, the safety requirements of this sort of exhibition.
And to find the space to
Well, 'cause
represent that voice.
Yeah.
I give another example. There was a woman who wanted to, because I always have brainstorm discussions too around like, what do you think you're going to take? Because I've learned that that's the way you find out these kind of sticky points, right? So a woman came forward and said, I know exactly what I'm going to take. I'm going to take a picture of the person who infected me, and I'm going to put these like around town, because this is a way for me to kind of advocate, right? Like, you got to watch out for this person,
Oh my God.
And it was like, okay, like that's super powerful, but hey, like, is that safe? I mean, I started with, is it safe for you? Like, because they see that, they're gonna get potentially really angry, and I don't feel like that's something that's safe, So she was on board, and instead she took a picture of a stack of letters from their kind of lengthy court battle. I don't know if you guys experience this in your states, but in Missouri it comes up a lot that people can be held, legally responsible if they infect someone else. And it's something that happens a lot in Missouri. So she did kind of hold him accountable legally for infecting her, and she took a picture of the stack of the legal letters. So again, we kind of came up with so the story is still there, right? And it's still really powerful, but it just wasn't safe for her to take a picture of him, let alone the ethics of like putting him out there. So
did you make decisions about, or did your participants make decisions about what images had an identity to them? Not the person in the photo, but the person taking the photo. Did you make decisions as groups when you had displays for those that were labeled the photographer and the voice that they had wanted to express, or those that were anonymous?
Ed, do you want to talk about that first?
So Bob, I'm trying to follow. I'm sorry. What was the question?
Do you mean identity around, I think, identity around like disclosing themselves as people with HIV? That's
or identity about who actually took the photos.
So it was actually a mix of participants. Some, so ours was not a group of people who were infected with HIV. It was African-American men who actually were non-gay identified, who were having sex with men. Mm-hmm. So, and what was their HIV prevention? And so some of them may have been HIV infected and some of them may not have been. So we talked about that. So it was completely anonymous. So that was like the important part that we had to kind of preserve around disclosure and around identity. And so the only photo that was really the issue was the one with the sun.
It's a really interesting idea, though, this whole notion, because Photo Voice is sort of grounded in this idea of identity and building a sort of social consciousness around that. And yet, because of those safety issues, some of the participants kind of get confused in terms of the expectations when they're coming out. We've just got a couple more minutes left, but I'm wondering whether you can both talk a little bit about managing those expectations of participants for really, the social change piece, right? How you bring people in and you say, we're going to do this exhibit and amazing things are going to happen. You probably don't say that, but how do you manage that? How do you...
Michelle, I'll just go first because I just want to just piggyback on what I had just said about the interesting concept of identity and disclosure. So for other Photo Voice projects that I've been involved in around prejudice and discrimination, so we did a Photo Voice project on Islamophobia, and we also did one on anti-Semitism. And we actually followed the same kinds of guides around, they were anonymous. So we go ahead, and that was like, we were like kind of forward thinking about that. They signed the consent forms. We go ahead and do both projects. And within that, as we know how empowering Photo Voice is, it was like such an extraordinary project that I actually went back to our IRB and asked, can we change our mind? They want to identify themselves now because they were so proud of the scope of work. And of course they said, no, you can't go back. And so it's that's, for me, that's a very interesting discussion around the issues of safety and issues of what we're doing here.
And it's kind of ownership too, right? I always think about Wendy Ewald and bringing, getting those kids to take photographs, and totally for sort of like art's sake, but at the same time having a great sense of ownership with their photographs. How do you negotiate?
So it's the ethical. So the other good thing is, and this is like, I'm sure with many of our projects, we have advisory boards. And so community advisory boards, and we bring it back to the advisory boards. And so it's not just like our own, not just the participants, not just the researcher, but it's also the advisory. So what do we do here? Here's the situation. So how do we protect, people? How do we go about doing this? And so that's, I think, what was really important for us to be able to do. So that was really interesting for me because, when you think about it, we're having public exhibits on prejudice and discrimination around Islamophobia. You have to kind of be thinking about safety issues.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I totally agree that, like, for me doing this work, the surprise was that, in some ways a surprise, I mean, not anymore, but at first, that people want it to be identified, because we're so focused as academics and, protecting them and the pseudonym and the IRB, and they're like, I want credit for my picture, and I want to go on Oprah with my picture, and I want to sell my pictures, and I want them all over the pharmacy downstairs, and I'm like, okay, like, it's hard because then you have to sort of explain, like, okay, I'm coming from this background, you're coming from this background, and I do try to meet in the middle. So what I did, maybe this will work for you guys. I'm excited to tell you because maybe it will. But for my for my publications, I have to use, like fake name pseudonyms. But for exhibits, the participants are allowed to choose. So we kind of split the difference, and MyRB was okay with that. And then participants got to choose in their kind of public exhibits if they wanted to remain anonymous or not. And in my publications, I told them, oh, it's this like weird academic thing we do. We have to have the pseudonyms, sorry to like separate you from it, but that's what we have to do.
Okay. So
saying that up front, I think helps with some of the expectations. But you also asked about expectations around change. I mean, this could be like a whole other podcast, right? But like, I totally respect the intent of Photo Voice to be this vehicle of social change, but I also realize that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different audiences. So, together as we start to form the project, and in the very first meeting, we talk about what that final exhibit will look like. And for example, one project I did was simply about kind of sharing with stakeholders like providers the sort of more intimate lives of women living with HIV so they understood their barriers. And that was like the bigger kind of oomph, right? But then individually, different things would happen. Like I had one woman take a picture of her, like a refrigerator that she had to drag out of a dumpster to put in her own apartment that wasn't fully working. And as a result of the exhibit, like someone got her a new refrigerator, So like, it was individual, but it was like part of this overall piece. I had somebody take pictures of this really like violent area of their neighborhood that was hidden by these broken down buildings, and she wound up getting other people to go with her and clean it up. So it's like, it's not like an entire social movement forms, but these little things happen in the overall context of a broad goal of moving forward. So to me, those things are still important as much as like, say, changing a law would be, because I just recognize that it moves slowly. So
but those are all incrementals. Every one of those things are things to celebrate. Right. They're incremental steps to changes of people's thinking. Every one of those providers that learned from your participants and the photos are now embedded with this vision and statement and image that somebody brought to their attention, and it could be changing their nature of their behavior right now. And so it's hard to measure these things.
It's
and that's
so
really
hard.
The challenge of our field.
Yes.
If you're pointing out all these things that are part of what we want to continue to discover and expand, because the method has so much potential, is doing so much good, and the things that you guys are both talking about is exactly what we want to celebrate and talk more about, right, Robin?
I love that, Bob. And we've got to close. Michelle's got to run. Ed's got to save San Francisco. But I do think it's these small changes, right? So Ed talked about that shift that he did with the photo of the kid, right, and blurring out the thing. And you've talked about the shift that you were able to negotiate with having the participant's name or not be on the photograph, right? So those tiny incremental changes in terms of how participants show their identity and claim their space, and also it spreads out to these other changes around the neighborhood. I'm desperate, Bob. At some point in time, we've got to talk about what's happening in the sort of private photo voice sphere in terms of exhibitions and stuff like that outside of the research. But this has just been a terrific conversation with the two of you.
Absolutely.
Ed, thank you so much. Thanks for bringing the idea to here. And Michelle, thanks for being game with talking about it. And I'm totally excited to see, hopefully we'll see some HIV ones in this new photo voice series. So we'll get a chance to read and see some more expansion. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
We are done.
Great,
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, you
Take
two.
care.